Okay, I've realised that most of the videos I upload tend to go almost a full 15 minutes. With that in mind, I'm going to try and keep this considerably shorter. I think that may be one reason why I don't get so many views, because I make my videos too long. So I'll get straight to the point. This is about the A-bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, which subsequently ended World War II. Very, very controversial event to this day, and that decision to drop those bombs will always be part of President Harry Truman's legacy, and some would argue would always cast a shadow over his presidency. It is true to say that the United States is the only country to have used nuclear weapons on that scale in aggression against the civilian population. Although there's been other examples of chemical weapons being used, we know of Saddam and Al-Anfal and so on. Anyway, I just want to lay out why I believe this was a necessary evil. The first and foremost, what happened in those cities was nightmarish. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed, maimed, burned horribly, and the destruction was apocalyptical. So whatever way you look at this, there's no way to sort of trivialize it or glorify it, and I don't think it should ever be glorified. But I think when people vilify the United States for taking that action, they're not really thinking objectively, because the simple fact of the matter is the Japanese government of the time was absolutely hell-bent on winning the war. To them it was a holy war, a religious war, a sacred war. Needless to say, many millions had already died in World War II. The Pacific Theatre was a particularly bloody theatre. The Imperial Army of Japan had committed appalling atrocities in China, which I believe are sometimes overlooked when we think about the A-bombs. Far more Chinese citizens died in 5 years of Japanese terror than the Japanese civilians who died in the A-bombs. And I'm not saying that one civilian death, I'm not saying two wrongs make a right. That's not the argument here. But what I'm saying is people need to put it into context. The fundamental question here is how many more would have died? How many more would have died if there hadn't been that action taken? I believe we'll never know for absolute sure. In history, it's hard to be retrospective with what ifs with such big events, but all the evidence would lead to the scenario that the war would have dragged on, and millions more would have died. Certainly more people than the number who died in the A-bombs. Now, some say the Japanese were close to surrender. I don't believe that, because I believe the mentality was one of absolute victory. There were some on the Japanese side who wanted to negotiate, but they didn't have the power. So the Americans, being the major allied force in that region, took that definitive decision. I say it's a necessary evil because it ended World War II. And I do wish pacifists would remember this fact. If you take the pacifist position on the World War II A-bombs, then by definition you support the theory that the war would have continued. You cannot pretend otherwise. You cannot say, oh, the A-bombs shouldn't have been used because civilians died, but it was bad, but the war is going to continue. What other way was there for World War II to end? In terms of the Pacific Theatre, what other way was it for it to end? Until someone provides a solid answer to that question, I think the simple reality is that A-bombs were a necessary evil. And some Japanese politicians have even come out and said, I believe it was a former mayor of Hiroshima, who said, I believe that this was a necessary action. Of course, it's influenced Japanese thinking ever since, and Japan's attitude to nuclear weapons, which of course is very understandable. It could be argued, of course, that the real evil was that they were developed in the first place by all those scientists. But let's not forget, it wasn't the United States that pioneered nuclear weapons. As early as, well, the early years of the war, Nazi scientists were thinking about a nuclear program. Having said that, I've just watched a video by a guy called Asao Hashimoto, presume that's a Japanese person, who uploaded a very interesting sort of timeline based on little coloured marker beeps to show every nuclear test since that time. There's been well over 2,000, and over half of those have been American tests. Of course, they peaked in the late 50s, and then there were several other points during the Cold War. The second highest was the Soviet Union, and then a distant third, I'm talking about numbers of tests here, I believe was France, then the United Kingdom, and then other countries that have performed nuclear tests: India, Pakistan, possibly Israel, we don't know for sure, China, most recently North Korea. Now, on the North Korean issue, so actually I'm amalgamating two issues in this. One is that I do believe that A-bombs are necessary, and I think pacifists should address this point: would World War II have continued? When innocent civilians die, that's always terrible, and there's no way that it should ever be glorified what happened. But I still put out the point that had such a devastating, morale-destroying event not taken place, would the war have ended? And you can't just say, strategic targeting of military installations in Japan. I think that's naive. That wouldn't have ended World War II. The Japanese regime had shown it was prepared to sacrifice its own civilians anyway. So it was a necessary evil as far as I'm concerned. Now, in terms of nuclear tests, the world is a much safer place since the Cold War ended. And the good news is that major powers like the United States, the Soviet Union, China, Great Britain and France have all shown a genuine desire to take part in nuclear non-proliferation. There hasn't been a British test since 1991. I believe the last American test was the early 90s. The last Soviet test was the early 90s. The last Chinese test was the mid-90s. So all of these great powers, it's been a long time since they've tested. India and Pakistan squared off in 1998. That was a very tense moment. But North Korea, I do believe, poses the biggest threat when we're talking about nuclear proliferation. Now, one of the common arguments about North Korea is, well, Americans have nuclear weapons, so why can't North Korea? That's a very childlike sort of response, because it's ignoring the fact that the American nuclear stockpile is significantly less than it was at the peak of the Cold War. And the issue here is non-proliferation. In other words, not building a stockpile. Yes, the Americans have nuclear weapons. It can be argued they shouldn't. And nor should my country, nor should China, Russia, and so on. But the point is, none of these countries have shown any desire to use these weapons. Any serious desire to use these weapons. Now, organisations like CND would argue that the very existence of these weapons is evil in itself, and I understand their argument, because nuclear weapons are a terrifying thing. The most destructive invention ever created by mankind. So I can understand their argument, I really can. But, like I say, the issue is about proliferation. Frankly, if I was the British Prime Minister right now, if I was David Cameron, my policy would be a significant reduction in our stockpile. I'm not sure exactly how many nuclear weapons we possess, somewhere around 150. I would halve that, at least. Maybe even cut it by up to 3/4. And I would do that as Prime Minister to set a precedent, to send out a message to other great powers to follow suit. So the eventual goal will be a nuclear-free world. But I believe a complete destruction in an instantaneous move would be very foolish when you have a country like North Korea, a paranoid totalitarian Stalinist state that constantly makes threats against its neighbours. And whilst the North Korean tests are relatively small scale compared to some that took place during the Cold War, for example, Tsar Bomba, the largest weapon ever tested by the Soviets in 1961, was much, much bigger than anything North Korea has tested. The fact that North Korea is prepared to do this shows it is a dangerous regime. And no one can justify that on the grounds, oh, America has nuclear weapons. Because the point is, the trend in recent years has been reduction, not proliferation. North Korea's actions do plunge the entire Northeast Asian region into danger. It threatens Japan, South Korea. I would argue it even threatens China. Now, China may be North Korea's only ally, but even the Chinese have taken quite a tough stance against this, because they recognise it would bring the whole region into instability. So there's absolutely no logic whatsoever for North Korea to have nuclear weapons. I do believe the Americans should continue along a trend of non-proliferation, and I would call on President Obama to make a significant step to reduce the number of American weapons further. But I don't believe in instantaneous unilateral disarmament. I don't think it's realistic. I don't think it would happen. I believe the right approach should be a gradual reduction and a vow from the great powers never ever to use these weapons. Of course, a vow alone isn't enough, but the trend is obvious, and the trend is reduction. North Korea has shown an arrogant disregard for this trend. So those are the issues. We've just passed the 68th anniversary of the end of World War II. Let's not forget how the world's most destructive war ended. Let's not forget the decision that made that war end. It was a terrible war, and it was a terrible but necessary event that had to end that. If you're Japanese and you feel offended by this video, I would never ever ever glorify in the death of those Japanese civilians. But you must also reflect on the actions your country had taken during the course of World War II. Not just against the Chinese, against numerous other Asian nations, against American and British POWs, Australian POWs. We should never overlook Japan's wartime atrocities. And that is just one factor as to why you have to understand why this decision was made. This was not a normal government, the Japanese government of the time, and I don't believe they could have been negotiated with in a normal, conventional wartime approach. So my conclusion is this was a tragedy, but it was a necessary evil. Thank you for watching.